Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing the fourth in the iconic legendary series of Shadow Pulp novels. This is of course the Red Menace, released in November 1931 in the fourth issue of the Shadow magazine, and once again written by series primary writer and creator Walter B Gibson under the house name of Maxwell Grant. Now this fourth story was the last of what Gibson was originally contracted to do by Straight & Smith, which was to write 4 stories to start a potential Shadow magazine to capitalize on the success of the character as generated as essentially a promotional host for the Detective Story Hour done to promote Street & Smith's own Detective Story magazine. But the character became so popular that they decided it would be a good idea to actually make a magazine, so all the people asking for the Shadow magazine would actually have a magazine to buy. So ostensibly, after this story, the magazine could have gone a different way, with Gibson no longer having his services required, or the series could have just ended there. And so I think in this fourth story, Gibson does take a little bit of risk in trying to do something a bit different with the story as compared to the first 3 books, which were dealing more with your average criminals or the criminal underworld. The Red Menace, as the title would indicate to someone looking at this, is dealing with communist agents inside the US, and also going all the way back to the Russian Revolution, which in 1931 wasn't all that too far in the distant past. It was less than 20 years since the time of 1917, 1918. So in this story, you have a major linkage of the Shadow as a character and the elements of his backstory that we don't quite know yet being linked back to the Russian Revolution, and also working as part of a secret society to try and aid the ill-fated Tsar Nicholas II. So even at this point, at the start of the series, there are more breadcrumbs being put down for the reader to follow to get little tiny nuggets of another piece of the Shadow lore, or the Shadow's history, even though we still don't know all we need to know about this character. The plot of the Red Menace sees a secret group in the United States of communist agents who are up to several nefarious schemes, and also are led by a very striking figure known only as the Red Envoy, who appears always in a crimson mask with gloves and is a fascinating figure who is very Shadow-like himself, and the reader doesn't know the identity of this figure nor exactly what the goals of this secret society are, but it's very clear that the Envoy is their de facto leader and is calling the shots, and always seems to appear and disappear in the shadows. So you have a wonderful mirror antagonist for the Night of Darkness in this story. The 2 main goals of the group in this story is to try and deal with Prince Zuvor, who's a character who actually escaped the Russian Revolution to the United States with a good deal of his fortune intact, and has just been basically hiding out ever since. And so now he's essentially been found out by this group and is having to live in fear for his life every day. But there are also particular strange goings-on at the wonderfully named Death Island, where a famed scientist is working on a series of experiments later revealed to be tests for his invention that he's working on for the War Department of aerial torpedoes. So this immediately ups the stakes because you have this secret organization trying to get their hands on an advanced piece of weaponry that might change the battlefield of the future. As with any Gibson-penned Shadow novel, especially in these early years of the stories, the Shadow remains a very mysterious character, always in the background, always several steps ahead of the reader, and the reader gets to follow the twists and turns of the mystery plotting, and especially uncover how the different plot threads are actually intertwined. It's typically only by the story's end that the reader gets the full picture, unless you're able to sort of guess ahead, but even then you're guessing, and you're only able to see the full puzzle completed by the very end of the story. The book is filled with wonderful scenes throughout. A good number of them are classic in the series, such as the wealthy playboy guys of the Shadow, Lamont Cranston, meeting with Prince Zuvor and indicating that he has knowledge of the secret society working for the Tsar from the past Russian Revolution days of the Seventh Star, which was the organization's name, and even takes the Shadow's famous Girasol ring and actually opens it so the prince can see the 7-star sign within the ring, which links even the Girasol ring to that organization, and thus cementing that background of the Shadow in and around the Russian Revolution. We see a great deal of action sprinkled throughout the story, in addition to returning figures from the agents of the Shadow, most notably Chief Agent Harry Vincent, who even gets a potential love interest in this story, which is something that happens every once in a while in the Shadow stories, and so that gives it another nice change of pace compared to the first 3 stories. There are some recurring characters from books 2 and 3 in this series in order to further the sense that this is all part of the same world and the same continuity, which is key for the Shadow's longevity and is probably Walter B. Gibson's greatest achievement in writing the Shadow stories, in that there is a sense of continuity. You do see characters and events referenced in other books or pop up in other books, and the stories build on one another, which is astonishing considering how long the series ran for and how many stories Gibson was cranking out per year. So we see the return of characters from the second book in the series, The Eyes of the Shadow, but we also see the return of Secret Service agent Vic Marquette, who appeared in the previous novel, The Shadow Laughs. So these characters nicely fold into this new plot, but again, it's all about keeping this feeling of consistency and being in the same world. The Shadow himself does a lot of the putting together of the puzzle pieces of the mystery, and also uses the famous invisible or disappearing ink, in addition to using radio broadcasts to pass messages on to his agents, who have to listen to radio broadcasts at a certain time and use the words that have extra enunciation on them to pick up the secret coded messages. But also we get the introduction of another vital part of the Shadow's arsenal in this story, and that's the Devil's Whisper. Now this is the famous substance that the Shadow uses to get in and out of tough scrapes by causing a distraction. And this is when you have the Shadow put his fingers together with a certain mixture of substances, and by snapping his fingers, he's able to cause essentially what would now be termed a flashbang, or a disorienting burst of light and sound all at once in order to quickly escape a room, or overcome gunmen, or get out of harm's way, or catch any evildoers by surprise, essentially. Now, you read this in the stories time and time again, so this is its first major appearance and is one of the most vital parts of the Shadow's bag of tricks. But you read about this and you think, oh, well, surely that can't be possible. I mean, I'm sure it has some basis in reality, but it being that powerful and being so simple, the reader might think it's not possible, but in fact, it actually is. The Devil's Whisper is actually something that was developed for stage magicians and used even to this day, and Gibson, being a master magician himself and having years of experience in the field, was able to call upon his knowledge of magicians and real-world techniques and actually put that into the stories, which further the depth of realism and how wonderfully realized they feel. So this is the most important element, I think, that pops up in this story for the first time. It's wonderfully utilized, it's never overutilized, and it will become an element used by the Knight of Darkness time and time again, right alongside things such as the iconic suction cups for climbing up and down the outside of buildings. The overall pacing of the story is quite good, so it's another sign that the books are growing as they go along, but it still is an early Shadow book. So the plus side of that is that the Knight of Darkness is at his most mysterious and most in the background, but the minus side of that is that you don't get the Shadow in action as much, and he takes much more of a back seat to the agent characters. So it's a bit of give and take with the early stories. The world of the Shadow is still being built. It's not 100% there, but with each book we're getting a little bit closer. And the real strength of the Red Menace is that it's doing something different from the first 3 books while still building upon it. and incorporating characters and elements of those three stories. So instead of feeling like an abrupt left turn coming after the first three books, it feels like a distinct growth from those three books. Possibly the best part of the entire story is actually the final climax, or I should say the post-climax scene, because we have a nice flurry of action and Harry Vincent once again caught in a sort of death trap, because I guess being the lead agent of the Shadow means also you're going to get caught in some sort of death trap or nearly get killed all the time. So I don't know if many people are actually going to want that job should he ever vacate it. But after what would be the action climax of any story, we get essentially the postscript scene where the Shadow actually leaves the United States and goes to Europe, which is a great thing, a great notion of the Shadow not just being limited to operating within the US, but we actually then get to deal with the actual villain and learn the true identity of the Red Envoy, and it is just as satisfying as you would hope in reading this story. So for me, and I think most Shadow fans, the best part of the story is actually the final scene, which has the right balance of summing up the mystery, unmasking the mystery villain, and dealing with the villain in a wonderful setting with just the right grace note of poetic justice. So it's a great closing to a really fantastic story that is really to be applauded for taking some risks and doing something different. And amazingly, it adds a great deal to the Shadow lore in terms of the history of this mysterious character who we're just getting to know, and this is happening only in the fourth book in the series. Now to briefly talk about the cover artwork. The original 1931 issue from November of that year features beautiful artwork with the classic iconic Shadow logo on the top, but we again have the Shadow in the classic profile on the back, so we are finally getting the established style of the Shadow covers, which at this point were by the artist Jerome Rosen. Jerome started doing the covers, who turned things over to his brother George, who then drew the rest of the covers at this point in the 1930s. Now this has wonderful detail and composition, and we have the Shadow on the back with a lovely striking white background to draw the eye, but then we have the figure of the Red Envoy complete with crimson mask and gloves. We have the figure being threatened, giving a sense of menace to the image, which is then increased by the looming figure of the Shadow with outstretched hand in the background. But then interestingly, down here in the bottom corner, you'll see with the title, the figure in a hood. And this is actually the original visual of the Shadow when he was just the announcer on the radio. So you'll see this image pop up at various points in the early days of the Shadow when they were still not quite sure how to visualize the Night of Darkness. And so at times this original radio incarnation image with the hood and sort of looking like he's pointing at something and looking off to the side is an image that will pop up time and time again. So here it's actually made it onto the cover in the bottom corner. It still looks relatively mysterioso, which is the term often used to describe the early days of the Shadow magazine, but it's much better that we actually have a more traditional image of the Shadow already emerging and being used as the actual Shadow on the cover. So in terms of composition, they didn't necessarily have to do this in the bottom corner, but it is a cool thing, and it's actually part of the artwork itself. It's not just, a stamp or a sticker put on the bottom corner, but it is interesting to note that they were still using the early images of the Shadow for the radio announcer incarnation. Later in the 1970s, the Red Menace was published as part of the reprints by Pyramid Books and a paperback with absolutely astonishing artwork by the legendary Jim Steranko. So this features the Shadow in full action with the dual 45s blazing on a blood red background, and in the background we see the glaring, blazing eyes in the crimson mask of the Red Envoy. So this just gives the reader looking at the cover so much to chew on. It promises so much that is delivered upon in the story, but it is an outstanding cover for the reprints and another example of why the Shadow paperback reprints of the 70s are so highly collectible for their cover artwork. And Steranko always outdid himself when doing Shadow covers, but this one is a prime example of why he was so outstanding at drawing Shadow covers. So while I always prefer having the original 1930s Pulp magazine cover for the story itself, this reprint cover is so good that it's one that I would certainly like to track down and have in my collection just because the artwork is so stunning. Now, I read this story in the Fantastic Sanctum Books reprint. This is available in their volume 91, which pairs it with the later Shadow story, The Black Circle. So again, this is volume 91. Now, Sanctum didn't print the books in order. They always paired them by themes typically. But you do get a lovely reproduction of the original cover for each story in each volume. So there is the original cover art for the Red Menace, and then you get a nice little blurb about each story. Inside, you have the same wonderful style of all the Sanctum volumes with the 2 books, and then the fantastic supplemental material, including the intermission essay by Will Murray. Sanctum reproduces the original dual-column format to give you the same experience as reading the original Pulp magazine, but resets everything in a nice, straightforward, easy-to-read text, so all of the pages are clean and easy to read. Here is the wonderful front piece artwork. And since this is the 4th novel and still early in the series, the only internal art is the front piece artwork. It took them a while to actually start adding additional pieces of art throughout the rest of the story. Then we have the wonderful Will Murray interlude article talking about the 2 stories and giving extra production and historical background, again highlighting the importance of the Red Menace being the 4th and final story in the original 4-book contract that Gibson had with Street and Smith. Then we close with a wonderful informative essay about the 2 artist brothers, Jerome and George Rosen, and how Jerome started on the Shadow series and actually did the original rendering of James Locurdo as the Shadow in terms of the initial version based on the radio series announcer incarnation, and then how Jerome left the series and it transitioned over to his brother George. And then this also gives us some fascinating work in progress versions of the artwork, which shows just how detailed the art is. And then you have a photo of the brothers as well. This is an example of the fantastic historical essay material that you can find in the Sanctum volumes that gets into the nitty-gritty of the production, but especially gets into the history of the people that made these iconic stories. And then, as always, the fantastic essay on the importance and legacy of Walter B. Gibson. Now, like every other Sanctum volume, these are incredible reprints, and I think set the gold standard for pulp reprints. The only problem is, when Sanctum lost the license from Condé Nast, all of the Shadow and Doc Savage and other volumes quickly went out of print, so you will have a difficult time finding these volumes. The earlier numbers are typically easier to find and thus less expensive on the used market because they were around longer and have more print runs. But this is 91, so it's getting closer to 100. Basically, the closer you get to 151, which is the last of the standard volumes, the harder it is to get them and the more expensive they get. And they've now gotten exorbitantly expensive, especially every volume after 100. So this is getting close to that. I had a tough time tracking down one of these, so I know you will as well if you're interested. But thankfully, there is the Pyramid Books reprint with the amazing Steranko artwork, so you can get that. And this is one of the Shadow novels that was not edited or cut down, so you don't have to worry about the older reprints not having the full text, because Sanctum would go back to original manuscripts and materials and restore the full length of every book. So that's another reason why the Sanctum volumes are so important. But if you want to try and find the 4th Shadow novel in the Sanctum reprints, you'll have to find this elusive volume 91. So those are my thoughts on reading the 4th Shadow novel, The Red Menace, and the incredible reprint in Sanctum Books volume 91. As always, I hope my babblings about the world of the Shadow and pulp fiction has been at least somewhat fun and informative. My aim with these videos is to hopefully encourage others to delve into the world of the pulp heroes and to learn more about the most important of pulp pulp heroes, the Shadow. So please do keep supporting the incredible efforts of the pulp reprint publishers who are keeping our popular history alive. Please keep supporting your local independent bookstores and comic shops by hopefully being able to pick up some Shadow reprints. Keep reading the magical world of pulp fiction, keep reading the Shadow, keep reading print books, and thank you ever so much for watching.